Jesus, His words, His wisdom, His world. And this afternoon, it'll be His world. Even more specifically, the geography of His world, His land. Use and abuse of Bible geography. You can abuse Bible geography by overemphasizing it, as if you would automatically become a little more holy by having come here to the Holy Land. But you can abuse Bible geography by neglecting it, and that's been a greater disease in our seminaries as of late. So that there are no places, no history events that didn't really happen when you abuse Bible geography by ignoring it. So I'm going to give the perfect balance. At least I would like to imagine that I'm giving a balanced view. And I want to start with John chapter 4 with the woman at the well, where Jesus is going through Samaria, and he stops at Jacob's well, being wearied as he was with his journey. It was about the 6th hour, and there comes a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus says to her, "Give me to drink." "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink of me, who am a woman of Samaria, since Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans?" And Jesus said, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that says to you, 'Give me to drink,' you would ask of him, and he would give you living water. Sir, you have nothing to draw with. The well is deep. Where do you have this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself and his children and his cattle? Whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. The water I shall give shall be in him a well of water springing up to everlasting life. Sir, give me this water that I thirst not, nor come here to draw. Go call your husband." "I have no husband." "You've said well that I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and he whom you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly." And then listen to what she does, the connection that she makes. "I see that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." And Jesus said, "Believe me, the hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor at Jerusalem will you worship the Father. For you worship what you don't know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeks such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." And listen to the connection she makes. "I know when the Messiah comes." She makes the connection. "I know when the Messiah comes, he will tell us all things." And she's the first one in the Gospel of John to whom Jesus says, "I who speak to you am he." He manipulated the conversation with her to the point where she makes a connection to Messiah, and he just has to say, "I'm the one." So I just now undermined all the holy places. There's a holy place in this story. It's Jesus. And then the woman becomes a holy place. She goes into the village and brings other people to Jesus. I knew a pastor who was proud that he had never come to Israel. He would not stoop, Protestant Pentecostal pastor that he was, to go on a pilgrimage to Israel. That's for Orthodox Christians. That's for Catholic Christians. That is not for proud Protestants, because the Spirit of the Lord is present everywhere in the world, which is obviously true, but he drew the conclusion that therefore you don't need to go to Israel. Well, then somebody in his congregation paid his way for him and his wife. Now that was too good an offer to turn down, even just, as a vacation. So the pastor came and he told me himself, he said, I couldn't believe my own emotions. I was startled. I was surprised by my own emotions. I got so excited about visiting places where events had taken place about which I've been preaching and teaching. And he began bringing tour groups to the land of Israel. The importance of geography. These are real places, real events, real people. Steve Notley was asked when he was speaking at Oxford to speak about Lucan priority. And out there in the world, that's kind of a maverick theory, because kind of everybody knows one of the results of scholarship is that Mark is the first gospel, and very few challenge that. I told something like that to a great light at Harvard University who had just written his magnum opus, Introduction to the New Testament. He said, well, I guess if there's room for fools like Farmer who thinks that Matthew's first, there's room for fools that think that Luke is first. Well, Steve Notley wasn't going to fall into the trap. He said, I'm not interested in Lucan priority. I'm interested in Jesus. And if you want to understand Jesus, learn his language. Learn his culture. Learn his world, and you'll have the tools to figure out for yourself what's the relationship between the Gospels. I love an expression that's used by John Munson, son of Jim Munson, who taught historical geography at the Institute of Holy Land Studies for decades, colleague of mine. His son is now teaching archaeology at Wheaton College outside of Chicago, Illinois. And he's come up with a new term, context criticism. You've got all these historical criticism, literary criticism, redaction criticism, so he's playing the technical jargon game, and he's come up with context criticism. If you want to understand Jesus, you better understand his context. Understand the text that tells about Jesus in its context, which means also what you learn from geography and from archaeology, from history. After this introduction, I want now to talk about Abraham, God choosing Abraham. Secondly, about Jesus as Emmanuel, with us, God, in history. And thirdly, some PowerPoint examples before a conclusion. Abraham, Genesis chapter 12, first place that's mentioned in the Bible, Shechem. And it's a place we know where it is. You can go there, you can visit it. I'm going to bless you, and you will be a blessing, and in you all families of the earth will be blessed. Sometimes people get uptight that it's not fair that God has a favorite. Well, look what we learn from the choice of Abraham already. He's being chosen for a servant position. He's being blessed so that he can be a blessing. Jesus said, I didn't come to be served, I came to serve. And he's saying the same thing as what God is saying to Abraham at the very beginning. In you all nations will be blessed. People have a hard time with this choice idea. And the skeptic says, how odd of God to choose the Jews. The cynic said, it's not so odd, the Jews chose God. They just made up these stories about their being chosen. The proud Jew says, it's not so odd, the Goyim Anoyim. The proud Christian said, it's not the Jews, it's us, you fools. We're the chosen people. Well, we're grafted into the chosen people. The tired Jew, and that's most Israelis, let God choose some other stooge. You want to be the chosen people? Take it. You like our history? You can have it. And as I've considered these options, I've come up with one. If not the Jews, whom then to choose? It's the Bible story that God, in his wisdom, decided to operate by choosing a man, choosing one individual in history. And we know where he lived, in Ur, and then he went to Haran, and then he came to Shechem. And these are locatable places. And the first time he brought somebody here, it was Abraham, and you have Abraham and a family. The second time, it's David and a nation. The third time is when Jesus is here, and the outreach begins to the whole world. This is the fourth time in history that people and land are together. What's going on now? Challenge some of your friends who don't think that this is anything of spiritual significance, the Jewish return, with what he's done in the previous 3 times that he had someone here, where the people and the land are together. And then if we think of the world of Abraham, can you find any other God of any other nation who is blessing his people so that they will be a blessing for others? No way. I mean, all the gods are is trying to protect their own people, or the people will be trying to manipulate the God to give a little more fertility to their wives and flocks and fields. But the notion that your God is using you to be a blessing for others rather than that it's all just for you, that is not an idea from this world. And you can't find it in Abraham's world. What you find is gods of nature, the cycles of nature that just keep repeating themselves. It's a world of myths about origins. What's a myth? An invented imaginary story, but with some truth about life. And so whether it really happened or not to a specific individual at a specific place doesn't matter, because all you're learning from the story is that you should be good to each other, or you shouldn't steal from each other, or some, basic ethics. That's myth. The Bible comes and demythologizes that ancient world of Abraham. It says, no, it's not just cycles. God is acting. There's a beginning and the end. He knows the end from the beginning. He's choosing Abraham. He's starting a process of redeeming the world by his choice of somebody specific in history. The Bible demythologizes the ancient world. And so you've got a progression. You've got a line. You don't just have cycles in nature. You've got a progression. This modern attempt to demythologize the Bible has got it all backwards. They're trying to pretend that the Bible is myth, and you need to demythologize it and to kind of forget the specifics of the stories to get at some of the ethical principles that are there. They've got it all backwards. They're, in effect, trying to mythologize the Bible, when the Bible is what demythologized the ancient world. And so among these folks, you hear lectures like the Old Testament and other Old Testaments. What does that mean? That the Old Testament is just kind of the chance, pre-Christian stage of the Jewish people, and every other culture has its pre-Christian stage before this wonderful ethical teacher showed up on the scene. I studied under Brevard Childs at Yale Graduate School, and he was actually an evangelical believing Christian, rather rare bird in some of those graduate circles. And he said, I'm under constant pressure to dissolve the Old Testament department, of which he was the chairman. Just make it one branch of ancient Near Eastern languages and literatures. And there are amazing similarities. 150 years ago, all we had was the Bible for ancient history. Now we've got a lot of archives that have shown up. Stories about creation. Marduk, the god of light, slays Tiamat, the goddess of the watery deep. And then you even listen, her name is Tiamat, feminine ending on Tiam. And what does Genesis say? The Spirit of the Lord was hovering over the face of the Tehom. And you can feel that some of these concepts are a part of the ancient Near Eastern world. And of course, if you're a skeptic and a cynic, all you do is emphasize the similarities and try to pull the Bible down out of its place of honor. But if you're an honest student or teacher, you look at the differences as well and try to find a God who is blessing his people because he wants them to be servants, to be a blessing to others. Or try to find a king who dedicates the temple and is trying to play it up as much as he can because he wants taxes to come to the temple. And Solomon, at the peak of the dedication ceremony, says, but will God indeed dwell on earth? Heaven in the highest heaven cannot contain you, how much less this house that I've built. That is not from this world. That's revelation for anybody to be able to say something like that. So totally out of touch with his times. Folks would have us believe that the universe is silent, and all that matters is how we interpret the silence. That's not the Bible. The Bible is Word. It's God's Word. It's God revealing himself through human beings. Now, geography and Jesus. What's the issue? The issue is that God acts in history. He actually is involved. If you look at the story of Jesus, there are a couple of dozen towns mentioned, and they're locatable. Geography destroys myth and exalts the incarnate Jesus. We're talking about events and places that can be checked, can be visited. I wonder if Christianity isn't the most geographical of all religions, because it's God acting in history. And I'd like to give some examples of this Word acting in history from Old and New Testament. Anyone who's traveled with me as guide throughout the land, which is my bread and butter work, knows that I have 4 categories when it comes to Bible places. Number 1, authentic. Number 2, traditional. Number 3, folklore. Number 4, nonsense. And if you like alliteration, that's proof positive. Number 1, a certain probability, from old Christian traditions. Barely possible, you know it's wrong, but you can't prove it's wrong. A lot of theology goes in that category too. And then 4, preposterous. So the first and the last are provable. Provable right, and the last one is provable wrong. And in between there's probable and highly improbable. And it's good to keep those straight. And we've got all kinds of category number 1 when it comes to the Scriptures. And that's what we'll take a look at. Christianity rests on the affirmation that a series of events happened at specific locations, which means that geography, history, and faith are inextricably bound together. Geography heightens the impact on our senses and emotions of the reality of these Bible places and events. One of our Bible translators was writing home and he said, I've been there. I've seen Mount Moriah. It's a real place. It's not like our stories, our myths, our sagas, our legends. Geography provides a rich and decorative illumination for our Bible reading, study, and especially for Bible translation, so that we can achieve more accurate Bible translations if you folks support Bible translators to be able to come here and have a chance to study and see some of these things that they're going to have to translate. And not sometimes do funny mistranslations and sometimes tragic translations, but that's another lecture. Israel's in the middle. It's a land bridge between Mesopotamia and Egypt. Between Mesopotamia and Egypt, between the Tigris and Euphrates valleys and the Nile River Valley. It's a buffer zone between these ancient civilizations of Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome and Egypt to the south. But what more central location between Europe, Asia, and Africa if you have a testimony that's designed to go to the whole world? I have set you, Jerusalem, in the center of the nations with the countries all around. And I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. The showcase people, the servant people. Why this location? It's God's choice, teaching trust, serving them, teaching them to serve so that they will display His glory among the nations. Located here at the cradle of civilization where writing was invented about the 32nd century BC, picture writing hieroglyphics in Egypt, and the cuneiform script in Mesopotamia. And then this amazing invention of the alphabet. Aleph, Bet. Aleph is the word for ox. Bet is the word for house. And somebody in the 15th century, and that's just when Moses is growing up in the household of Pharaoh in Egypt, somebody in the 15th century down in the Sinai Peninsula where there were Hebrew slaves working on the mines of the Egyptians had the idea Aleph is not going to stand for ox anymore. A picture of an ox won't be an ox. A picture of a house won't be a house. The picture of an ox will be the picture of a house, bait, will be just B. And so in 22 letters you can express human speech. And it was there in time for Moses to write the Torah in the alphabet. This ox house system where it stands for sounds and not for the thing that's being pictured. Our letter A is an upside down picture of an ox head. The legs of the A were horns of an ox on the original picture. Fertile Crescent with those rivers and ancient centers of civilization. The land specifically is 4 divisions: coastal plain, central hills, Jordan Rift Valley, and the Transjordanian highlands. And let's take a look at this Rift Valley. It's one of the most striking features geographically on the surface of the entire earth, the entire globe. This depression here at the Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level at the surface of the Dead Sea, and then it's another 1,300 feet deep. There's nowhere in the world where you can go further down than that without going underwater. And that's where Jesus chose to be baptized. Think about it. Isaiah prayed, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down." How far is the God of Israel, the Creator God, King of the universe, ready to come down? In Jesus, he comes down near the Dead Sea, the lowest place on the surface of the entire globe. And the traditional places of the baptism is in the Jordan, near Jericho. And he goes even further down. What humility. John tries to stop him. He said, "You don't need this." He said, "I must for righteousness' sake, for the rightness of totally identifying with us, even in our need to be washed clean from sin." What humility. That's how he starts his public ministry. And not only that, all 3 of the major passion predictions, 2 for sure, were in that same Jordan Valley that ends in the Dead Sea. Jordan in Hebrew, Yarden, from the word Yored, going down. It's the going down valley. No river in the earth goes further down than the Jordan River. And we have the 3 major passion predictions, one on the way to Caesarea Philippi, one right after he comes down off the Mount of Transfiguration, and one while he's passing Jericho. Caesarea Philippi is way up in the north at the foot of Mount Hermon. And while they're on the way, he asks the 2 most important questions in the world. Who do men say that I am? And then, who do you say that I am? And Peter comes up with a fantastic title of greatness. You are the Messiah of God. But he hardly gets that out, and Jesus compliments him and says, "You didn't figure that out by yourself, Peter. It was the Holy Ghost revealed it to you." And then Jesus starts talking about suffering and dying. He's got a different idea about greatness. And then Peter says, "No, not you, Lord. You're not supposed to suffer." And Jesus had to say, "Get that satanic idea away from me. Get behind me, Satan," with the idea that I wouldn't have to suffer. And the next one, we're told 6 days later he went up to a high mountain apart. It's the only place where it says high mountain in all of the New Testament. So some of us Bible geographers like to think that it was right there on Mount Hermon. Now, he could have gotten to Mount Tabor about 1,500 feet in elevation, as over against Mount Hermon, which is 9,000 feet in elevation. And Jesus hardly gets down off the Mount of Transfiguration, and he's telling about he's going to suffer and die. Right there at the headwaters of the Jordan River. That's not 100% sure, because in 6 days he could have easily gotten to Mount Tabor, which is where it's been commemorated since the 4th century. It's impressive overlooking the Armageddon plains. But now the last one, for sure, was in the vicinity of Jericho. And the disciples are having an argument who's going to be the greatest. Jesus is going up to Jerusalem. He's going to reveal himself. Who's going to sit at his right hand. And Jesus not only talks about suffering and dying, he even specifies, I'm going to be crucified. So look at the tremendous suitability between Jesus going to that lowest place and under the waters of the Jordan to begin his public ministry, and in that going down valley, when greatness is the issue, he's talking about suffering and dying. It's a quote from Jesus, I do nothing. Remember the continuation? Except what the Father tells me to do. That was his idea of greatness. He was a servant. He was a favorite, yes, but he was a favorite to be a servant, and it cost him everything. And Jesus' favorite scriptures were Deuteronomy and Isaiah. So let's go to some of these scriptures. Here's one from Isaiah. This is going to be botany now, from the world of the Bible. Desolation. City gates going to be battered to ruins. Like the shaking of an olive tree. What's that? Well, you pick as many olives as you can, and the ones that you can't reach, you take a bamboo pole and whack the tree and knock off the rest onto cloth, or nowadays plastic, that you put under the tree. And you can still see olives harvested this way. But here's another reference from Isaiah. What's it going to be like if you disregard the Lord and choose not to obey and receive his blessings, but instead come under his judgments? It's going to be like the shaking of an olive tree. 2 or 3 olives left on the topmost bough, that's all that's going to be left. You are going to be cleaned and lose everything you have. Let's look in the days of Isaiah. And here we have a reference. Hezekiah made a pool and a conduit, a tunnel, to bring water into the city. Well, there is the Gihon spring, and here is the pool of Siloam that we heard about. And Hezekiah, the Bible tells us, built a conduit. So let's watch the water go from the Gihon spring, there it goes, to the pool of Siloam, about 500 meters, under the ancient city of Salem or Jebus, or the city of David. And there's the pool of Siloam. Here's the Gihon spring. Here's the pool of Siloam that we know a lot more about after the lecture this morning. Gihon spring, pool of Siloam, cross section. And in that tunnel, they find an inscription that tells about the digging of the tunnel from both ends and how they met. An inscription that's now in Istanbul in ancient Hebrew. So let me summarize 4 points. How can you measure the importance of Bible geography? Number 1, remove it and see what you've got left. And that's what happens at our seminaries. You've got some ethical teachings left, and sometimes even independent of Jesus. So you turn to the Gospel of Thomas, these apocryphal Gospels, and of Judas. 2, reality of it all. God acts in history. It's true. It is essential that the places exist. It's not essential that you visit them, but it's valuable because you get that emotional impact that God has acted here. It's valuable for us to know the places. It's helpful for others because it can undermine their doubts. When you can show things like Sennacherib and Nineveh and Hezekiah and a Bible record being reflected in Assyrian records, that can undermine the doubts of people who want to just put the whole Bible story aside. 3, God's precision of place. We know the concept fullness of time. In terms of the Romans, there was the Roman peace. You could travel the whole Roman Mediterranean world without a passport. In terms of the Greeks, you had a universal language like English of today, Greek of that time. You could go any place and speak Greek and be understood. It was the right time in terms of the Jews because they were being oppressed by the Romans. They were looking for deliverance. We know that concept, fullness of time. But how about another concept, precision of place? And fourthly, we gain respect for Jesus as God among us, for the incarnate Word, God in the flesh. And when Jesus left, the message was, this same Jesus is coming back in like manner. That's exciting. To this city. Come, Lord Jesus.